If you've got a Jeep JK, like this rig right here, and maybe you've upgraded to a larger set of tires like 40s, like this rig right here, you have to address the gearing inside of the axles. Well, Yukon Gear Axle now has you covered with a complete regear kit for the Jeep JK. That includes everything you will need to regear both the front and rear axle in one box. The kit comes with 2 ring and pinions and 2 Master Install Kits. Master Install Kit comes with everything you need to rebuild the axles. Bearings, crush sleeves, fasteners, even both axle seals and a seal for the pinion yoke. We'll start with the front. Now you certainly don't have to remove the front axle to install a gear set, but it's going to make it a lot easier to film for you guys to see each step. Leave this top center bolt in, but backed out a little bit. That'll keep the cover from falling to the floor. You have to remove the caliper bridge, and the rotor in order to get the axle shafts out of the carrier. Remove the ABS wires from the holders to give you enough slack to pull the unit bearing out of the knuckle. Unbolt 3 unit bearing retaining bolts. You'll need a 12.13 millimeter for this. Once they're loose, you can go at them with a regular old ratchet wrench. The unit bearing and the axle shafts should now come out of the axle housing. It may need a little bit of prying with the pry bar. Doesn't have to come all the way out, just out far enough so that it is no longer engaged into the differential. Repeat this process on the other side. You will have to disconnect the tie rod in order for the carrier to get clear of the housing, but before you remove the bearing caps, make sure you mark them so you know which side they're from, as well as the orientation. So I marked them on the top side with 2 dots on one and 2 vertical dots on the other. Then you can remove the differential carrier. Make sure you pay attention to the spacers that are on either side of the side bearings. I like to place them on the axle housing on the side that they come out of so they don't get lost. We'll now remove the pinion nut, followed by the yoke and the pinion. Once the nut is removed, I use an air hammer with a punch in the divot on the end of the pinion. Don't forget to get the crush sleeve out of the axle. Now we can hammer out the seal to gain access to the rear pinion bearing. Then remove both bearing races from inside the housing. With the housing empty, we're going to clean it out with a little bit of brake clean and a rag. Then we can remove the inner axle seals. Open your Master Install Kit and organize all the parts. The Master Install Kit comes with 2 crush sleeves in case you over tighten it on initial setup. If you don't use the second one, keep it in your toolbox for your next gear job. It also comes with 2 different size ring gear bolts as well as a ring gear bolt spacer to be used on different applications. All the shims that you will need for proper setup, as well as a new oil slinger and yoke seal. And of course, all new bearings, races, and a pinion nut to ensure a complete rebuild. Even new inner axle seals. We will start our rebuild by installing the pinion bearing race into the housing. Don't forget the oil slinger that goes underneath it. It's good practice to use a bearing race driver for this particular job. It ensures that the bearing race goes in perfectly straight. You will know the bearing race is fully seated when the driver bounces when you hit it. Pinion depth on the Jeep JK Dana 30 front is set by a shim that goes between the bearing and the pinion head. To determine the thickness of that shim, you can use a pinion depth checking tool, but for a baseline, refer to the installation instructions that came with your gear set. Once your shim thickness is calculated, drop it onto the pinion head, and you can press on the pinion bearing. Using the Yukon clamshell bearing puller, remove the side bearings from the stock OE carrier. Unbolt the ring gear from the carrier and then hammer the ring gear off using a brass strip. Clean the carrier thoroughly and inspect it for damage. Here's a tip. If you cut the cage off your original bearing, you can use the internal race as a press spacer because it'll line up perfect with the new bearing. Go over the back side of the ring gear with a flat file just to ensure there are no burrs, and then you can install it onto the carrier. I use 4 of the original bolts to draw the ring gear onto the carrier and then seat it with a dead blow hammer. I then remove the 4 original bolts and dispose of them. After cleaning the new bolts with some brake clean, apply the thread locker that's included in the Master Install Kit. And then all the ring gear bolts are started by hand. Torque specs are listed in your installation instructions. New axle seals are then pressed into the tubes. The rear pinion bearing and seal can go into the housing. The crush sleeve is then installed onto the pinion, and the pinion can go into the housing. The pinion nut is then tightened. And when the crush sleeve is crushed, we'll measure the rotational load until we get the specified amount. I work at this slowly, only allowing the nut to turn about 1/8 of an inch at a time, and then checking it with my hand. Once I think I have enough preload, I will check it with an inch-pound torque wrench. You want to read the actual rotating torque as the pinion is turned. I like to use a dial torque wrench with a pointer that records its last measurement. In this case, exactly 15 inch-pounds. Before installing the carrier, I put some high temperature grease on the inner axle seals so they don't start dry. Because we're reusing the factory carrier, I'm going to start by reinstalling the factory shims in their original locations. A shim driver is a great tool to have for hammering in these shims. Then I'll reinstall the bearing caps, paying attention to the witness marks that I made previously. I'll tighten the bearing caps and torque them down. For this particular axle, the bearing cap torque is 60 foot-pounds. Now we're ready to check backlash and our gear tooth pattern. If the backlash wasn't to spec, you would swap out the OE shims with the shims that come with your Master Install Kit and adjust the distance between the ring gear and the pinion until you get the required 6 to 10 thousandths of an inch. Before applying the gear tooth marking compound to the ring gear, mix it with some synthetic gear oil to make it easier to read. Paint the marking compound on 3 or 4 teeth, both sides, before rotating the carrier assembly in the axle. Remember to apply pressure onto the ring gear while you rotate it in order to get the correct read on the pattern. Remember, you want the pattern square on the tooth from top to bottom, not front to back. Check your pattern against the acceptable patterns in your installation instructions, and if your pattern is good, your axle is done. The rear axle in the JK is similar to the front. Now, just like the front axle, I removed this from the vehicle just to make the video a little bit easier. Obviously, you don't have to do that to re-gear it. If you're working on this axle in the vehicle, you may have to disconnect the axle track bar in order for the cover to be removed. Remove all the differential inspection cover bolts, leaving the top bolt in place so the cover doesn't fall off. Remove the caliper and the caliper bridge in order to gain access to the axle retaining nuts. Okay, I'm gonna grab an 8. Once all the bolts are removed, the axle can be removed from the axle housing. A small pry bar between the retaining plate and the housing will help get the axle moving. Take care not to damage the rear wheel speed sensor when removing the axle. And like the front, it doesn't have to be fully removed, just out far enough so the axle shaft clears the carrier. This is also a good time to inspect the axle bearing as well as the race and make sure the seal isn't leaking. Just like on the front axle, we have to mark the bearing caps. I'll do a horizontal dotted line on the right-hand side and a vertical dotted line on the left. And then pry out the differential. Remember, once again, keep track of the factory shims. You may be able to reuse them on installation. With the differential out of the way, we can now remove the pinion. Remove the pinion seal, the secondary pinion bearing, along with the races from inside the housing. With the housing empty, we'll give it a good clean. Just like for the front, your rear Master Install Kit comes with everything you're gonna need: bearings, pinion seal, bolts for your ring gear, all the shims to set up the differential correctly, and 2 crush sleeves. Start reassembly by installing the bearing races into the housing. Clean and wash the diff cover and the differential. Shims for pinion depth go between the pinion head and the bearing. To calculate the thickness of this shim, once again, use a pinion depth checking tool. For a baseline measurement, consult the instructions that came with your gear set. Once again, using the Yukon clamshell tool, remove both side bearings from the differential, and then unbolt the ring gear and knock it loose with a brass drift. New side bearings are pressed onto the differential. Install the secondary pinion bearing, oil slinger, and the pinion seal. Pinion bearing preload is set just like the front axle, with a crush sleeve on the pinion in between it and the secondary pinion bearing. Pinion is then installed along with the crush sleeve, followed by the yoke. the washer and the nut go on, and they are tightened until the crush sleeve is crushed, and we read 22 to 35 inch-pounds of rotational load. Install the ring gear onto the carrier using the same process that we did on the front. After cleaning the new bolts with some brake clean, apply the thread locker that's included in the Master Install Kit. Install the bolts into the differential by hand. Ring gear torque spec is 135 foot-pounds. The differential carrier is now installed back into the housing. The original shims are reinstalled at first to check backlash, and the caps are installed paying attention to the witness marks that we made on disassembly. Once again, using our shim race driver to drive the shims home. Backlash is checked, and once again, we're looking for between 6 and 10 thousandths of an inch. With backlash to spec, we'll paint on the gear tooth marking compound. Apply pressure to the ring gear while rotating it, and then check your gear tooth pattern. And then compare your gear tooth pattern to the installation instructions. If the pattern is good, the axle can be reassembled. And now your rear Dana 44 axle is geared to match the front.